Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Redditors who went to school with someone who committed a heinous crime. What happened? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I went to high school with a guy who, in our mid-20s, was in a bar and struck up a friendly conversation with a random guy. They chatted for a long time, and then the guy I went to school with said goodbye to his new friend and went to leave. He stopped halfway to the door, went back, slit the throat of the guy he had been chatting with, and then continued on his way like nothing happened. This was 15 years ago. If I recall, as far as I know, he's still in prison. At trial, he said he had no recollection of the day's events. He sat behind me in 3 college classes, stopped showing up, and I later saw him in a news article. Robbed a store, got in a shootout with police, and shot himself in the head. Used to have lunch every day with a kid who had a myriad mental and developmental disorders. We always made a point to make sure he felt part of the group and our conversations. After being at our school for 6 months or so, he stopped showing up. Turns out, he bashed his brother's head in with a brick and left his body in a creek. In court, his legal team claimed he believed his brother was a goblin in a fantasy world that existed inside his head. He was declared unfit to stand trial and will probably spend the rest of his life in psychiatric care. He was always such a nerdy, straight-edge kid in high school, and because we both played competitive soccer, we had hung out a couple of times and I thought he was chill. Found out via the news about 4 years after high school, 21 years old, that he kidnapped his underage 16-year-old ex-girlfriend, drove her around to different parking lots across my hometown and R''d her repeatedly. Held a knife to her throat, all while racking lines of cocaine on the middle armrest, all around 8 a.m. Cops arrested him at gunpoint after a couple-hour standoff. His parents are such good people, and his behavior plus arrest really devastated them. He spent 5 years in prison, and since his release, I think they shipped him to India to live with relatives. Not exactly a classmate, but a fellow member of a college computer club, chopped up a city waterfront commissioner, was on America's Most Wanted, fled to Mexico, was caught, and faced the death penalty. Didn't really know the guy, but apparently his father was a big donor. Consequently, the school would look the other way to avoid seeing his raging drug problem. He'd get wasted, call up guys he had crushes on, and talk about wanting to have sex with them in pornographic detail. People would report him, and nothing would happen. This went on for months, and was a known thing on the floor I lived on. Finally, he got a hold of a pistol and used it to hold up a bank. Arrested by local PD, he was allowed to quietly take a medical leave while he sorted out his trial, leaving open the possibility of returning at some point. That last bit got me angry because a different person I knew had developed a drinking problem and sought treatment. The school was not cool with that and gave him all kinds of grief. Immediately fired from his RA job when he disclosed it. All kinds of follow-up about his grades and approvals about when he could come back in. I unfortunately have too. Went to school with a guy who wasn't very nice and also got bullied some. After high school, I would run into him and catch up, and his life was not good. Got into drug problems, job problems, poverty. Then I just didn't run into him anymore. About 10 years ago, I was scrolling around Facebook and saw a picture of him posted by someone I didn't know. Apparently, a family was trying to hunt him down vigilante style because, according to the post, he had R''d their adult daughter. About 2 days later, and his mugshot is plastered online and in the news. Police arrested him. He was found guilty of drugging and R''ing a former female friend. He did prison time. He's out now, but a registered offender. The other guy recently was in national news for murdering his ex-wife. He shot her after breaking into her house. His family has money and problems. I'm sure he thought he could lawyer his way out of the trial. He's currently in prison and will be for a long time. Had a friend, little brother of my classmate, freshman to our junior. He disappeared one night, went out to watch a comet, and never returned. We all had suspicions about another classmate, but nothing came of it. No one really listened to us kids. Lots of stories about Jamaican drug gangs and runaway ideas. Accomplice finally confessed years later. Kid that murdered him was already in jail for another murder he committed right after I graduated. He was hanging out drinking beers with us graduation weekend. No one believes kids. I've been wanting to tell this story for some time. In 2011, I was a junior in high school and sat next to a foster kid in my law legal class. He seemed a lot older than myself and my classmates. He was clever and resourceful and beloved by my teacher. She was a retired former sheriff. She even introduced him to her husband, also in law enforcement, at the end of the school year party. Told him about my classmates' law enforcement aspirations. We hadn't been out of high school for a year when he murdered a custodian at a tea shop at 5 in the morning. He was there waiting for a girl who was scheduled to open that day. He tried to coax her inside, but she locked him in from the outside and called the authorities. He had ropes, knives, etc. in his possession. He was sentenced to life in prison. My good friend from high school had a younger brother that went on a road trip with his girlfriend to Yellowstone National Park, where he murdered her. The search for her and him was a big national news story for several weeks, and our small town was swarmed with reporters for a while. Eventually they found her body and he killed himself. It was pretty surreal hearing his name on the national news over and over again. It made the world suddenly seem very small. Also, it was bizarre because there were all kinds of conspiracy theories that popped up about his family being connected to powerful people who helped fake his suicide and allowed him to flee the country, and it was like, nah. I still talk with his sister occasionally. We used to play World of Warcraft together, and he's dead as F, and they were just a family of broke-ass backwards Jehovah's Witnesses. I went to high school with 2 murderers, believe it or not. One of them killed his girlfriend at 18 years old after they broke up in a local park, caught and sentenced to life without parole. The other was absolutely abhorrent. A kid I grew up with, who was a sadistic bully and animal abuser, beat a much smaller hapless student at my school within an inch of his life in a fight and received only a slap on the wrist from the legal system, which many perceived to be due to the status as an athlete and his father being a police officer. A few years later, there were allegations he had battered his significant other, and one of the girls in my group of friends who dated him was so afraid of him that she would not even go into public places in our town out of fear of seeing him. There were others who felt that way. Well, unsurprisingly, he had been in and out of jail for assault charges and such, and eventually he was tied to the murder of a man at a bar following a fight and was wanted by police. A couple of days went by and he eventually turned himself in, and he passed away from health issues before there was a trial, I believe. I'm making an assumption here. I think this is the Gabby Petito story, and she's actually from the town over from me here on Long Island. And I know the guy was from Florida, but it happened in a national park. It was big news like a year and a half ago, so rest her soul. Kid at my school was a stereotypical druggy burnout, total piece of shit that everyone hated. Years later, I found out that he was arrested for manslaughter for the death of his girlfriend's 9-month-old baby. I remember reading the list of injuries the baby had when they finished the autopsy, and it made me sick. F that prick. Thankfully, he's in prison for the next decade, and hopefully he gets treated like those kind of people do in prison. My family moved halfway down the country when I was 12, and my mum quickly made friends with a local woman with a daughter the same age who went to the same school as me. In rural New Zealand, farming kids that are a long way from school, we were over 40 kilometers, the bus had one local pickup point for each small town on the route, and the parents would generally take turns running the local kids to and from the pickup point. So I was basically forced to form some sort of acquaintanceship with this girl. She always scared me a bit. There was something off about her. I always felt like a mouse and she was a cat around her. I can't really explain anything she did around me that contributed to the feeling, but I never formed a friendship with her. Her mom would spend a lot of time talking to my mom about what a hard time she had with her and how she was afraid of her own daughter. She had multiple run-ins with the law from the mid-teens and onwards, including things like running over a cop who had pulled her over, etc. She eventually murdered her partner, took his body far out of town and buried him in a shallow grave in the bush, and then parked his car somewhere to look like he had abandoned it. It took the police months to get her for it. Can't say I was surprised that she did it. A fellow student who was a friend of some friends. We hung out with him a few times, dinner, gaming, that sort of thing. He was always a little quiet. One day, he just disappeared, and no one knew where he went. I walk into class and sit down. Professor's a little late, walks in with a newspaper, stares at the class and asks, "Did you hear?" We're all looking at each other like, what the F are you talking about? He holds up the newspaper, turns a couple pages, and holds it up. Sure as shit, our friend's mugshot is right there. Turns out, he was, if I remember correctly, a serial artist, and had been R-ing students on the lower campus on and off for some time and finally got caught. That was wild. This was something like 25 years ago. Never in a million years would have expected that. Not a classmate, but a dude I worked with. He got into a fist fight with his brother one day. He wound up killing his brother, chopped off his head, arms, and legs, put all the body parts in Tupperware containers, and spread them across 3 counties. His wife went shopping soon after. When putting her stuff in the trunk, she found the head. She's the one who turned him in. There was a guy in my school that got into alcohol and drugs at a more extreme level than was normal, like too much vodka at a high school game to be hospitalized. He started getting into some heavy stuff like fentanyl. I left for the military, and while gone, I learned he stabbed his mother to death in the garage, which was witnessed by the neighbor. He's now in prison, obviously. I moved back to my hometown after 17 years with my wife and kids. Later learned it happened in the house across the street from my new house. Good friend from high school got in a fight at a party a few years after he graduated and killed a guy. In high school, there's people that will jump in and break up a fight that's going too far. After high school, apparently not. He beat the other guy's head into the hood of a car until the skull was crushed. He served something like 20 years for it. My classmate's brother had murdered their mother in the middle of the night before he attempted to light the house on fire and leave my classmate to burn to death. He thankfully survived, but my sister was in his brother's class, and we both felt freaked out by it for years. I only had a few classes with him when I was younger, and I only remember him being a bit of an asshole. My sister said the older brother was a bit disquieting, and she was too scared to talk to him in the classes they had together. There's just something chilling about the memory I have of the older brother dragging my classmate onto the same dumb spinning ride over and over again until he threw up, knowing that in a few more years, he'd be trying to murder him after brutally murdering their mother. Not a classmate, but a much younger next-door neighbor. I was already an adult with my own family when this happened. Kid was 15. He used to come and watch my dad and I work on my Mustang when I was a teenager, and he was much younger. Anyways, he was staying with his mom, and she wouldn't let him go and stay the night with his girlfriend. So he waited until she fell asleep and beat her to death with a hammer. Then he stole her car and went to his girlfriend's house, did a bunch of drugs and effed her all night, and then tried to commit suicide by ODing on pills. When he woke up in the hospital, he was placed under arrest. Supposedly, he started crying and confessed, and was worried that he might get in trouble for what he did. He's in prison until he's about 60, I think. He wanted to start his life over, so he and his brother locked 2 of his boys in their bedroom and set fire to the living room containing his wife and another son. The wife woke up and rescued their 2-year-old daughter from the nursery. Outside, he had his wife move their minivan, and while she was distracted, he tried to put the daughter back in the house through a broken window, but was stopped by a community member. The 3 boys all died, and the wife was seriously burned. Went to high school with someone who was later found with CP on their computer. Dude always was an Eddie Haskell type, so I never trusted him, but I never expected that. Another guy was accused of child molestation, but it was like a game of telephone. The child was 17 and the guy was 19. They were both gay at the time, when it wasn't really accepted. Last I heard, he had changed his name and moved across the country. There was a kid in my high school who was really weird. Frankly, he was that way since middle school, but it got way worse. He was also very mean to everyone else and got bullied all the time because of it. It was horrible sitting next to him in class. He would do all kinds of weird shit. So after we all graduated and went to college one day, I was sitting in my dorm room reading the local news back from my hometown, and I saw that this kid had stabbed his mother 30 numerous times at his house, and then ran away and went to the local mall until he got arrested there. The crazy thing is, his mother lived. Not sure where he is now. This was around 14 years ago. He went to my elementary school for a bit before transferring to another school. He was super weird. During lunch, he would bite 2 holes out of his bologna from his sandwich, place it on his face, and tell everyone that he was Bologna Man. In sophomore year, he joined the local high school, but never told anyone why he didn't complete freshman year with the rest of us. He was the IT guy. Girls wanted to be with him, guys wanted to be him. Turns out, he was still weird even in high school. One Halloween, he came to school dressed as Hitler. About a decade after high school, he was arrested in a murder case of a local waitress. Apparently they were dating and he got jealous one night and killed her. He was found guilty and put in jail a few years ago. Turns out, he missed freshman year because he beat his younger brother and tied him to a tree in the front yard. He was sent to military school that year. Needless to say, there were definitely signs of what was to come. Great guy with a shitty life. Poor, broken family. He fell in with the wrong crowds and started doing drugs, got clean, then his dad died, got back into drugs, then he was used for what I can only assume to be a mafia-orchestrated, possibly politically motivated crime. To protect his anonymity, I will only say he was allegedly sent to set fire to some offices. I'm certain that the same guys who put him up to it are the ones who ratted him out as a scapegoat, since he was not involved with the mafia or any organized group, just a mourning junkie used as a tool. On the very same night, he and his girlfriend's houses were raided, and he was picked up from a den and severely beaten. After a year in prison, despite the police and prosecutors being absolutely sure he was the culprit, the trial was held, and there was no actual evidence that he'd done anything, so now he's free and off drugs and doing better. Life keeps throwing him curveballs, but he's pulling through. Brian Bassett dropped out and ran away our freshman year, got all high on meth and murdered his mom, dad, and 5-year-old brother. His sister was at her boyfriend's house. His dad was our baseball coach, and I stayed many of nights at their house and drive by it every time I go to my dad's house. They blasted Silverchair's Israel's son when they commuted the crime, supposedly, and his defense drugged the band into it. Pretty wild for a town of about 2,000 people. Sat directly next to a student for multiple years, similar last names sat alphabetically, always got a bad vibe and was scared of him. He was totally normal and sweet one-on-one, but in any other scenario, he was so angry, would have outbursts if anyone got near his binder, and he just had this look in his eyes that freaked me out since we were like 9 years old. Remember one time, someone accidentally put a crease in his quiz paper that we were group grading, and he tried to stab them with a mechanical pencil after just screaming at the top of his lungs. This was well into high school, too. A few years after graduation, found out he got caught after long-term sexually abusing his wife's sister, who was only 11 years old. He also had a young daughter of his own at home. There was talk there was some CP possessed, but he ended up taking a plea deal for the crime against his sister-in-law, so nothing else ever came out about what else he was investigated for. Only 6 months in county jail, 10 years probation, and he's already halfway through probation. As far as I know, he's moved around a lot since being on probation. No idea where the guy is, though, which is a scary thought. He's pretty much a ghost at this point. I went to high school with Martin Mary Tankliff. He would have graduated the same year I did. He was convicted of murdering his parents September of our senior year. In an interesting turn of events, it was later found out that he was wrongly convicted of murdering his wealthy parents. After serving almost 18 years in prison, his conviction was vacated and he was released from prison in 2007. He's now an attorney and helps others that have been wrongfully convicted.